the semicolon and the colon. In this slideshow, we're going to discuss various common uses of the semicolon and the colon. So we will be discussing use of the colon between independent clauses, between items in a series containing internal punctuation, and then we'll talk briefly about common misuses of the semicolon. We'll also discuss the uses of the colon when it's used with lists of positives and quotations, conventional uses of the colon, and lastly, we'll talk briefly about misuses of the colon. Starting with the semicolon, we use the semicolon between independent clauses that are not joined with a coordinating conjunction. We talked in our last lecture about joining two independent clauses to make one sentence by using a comma and a coordinating conjunction. Here's an example. The girl forgot her bag in the gym. She returned and found it in the same spot she left it. When we include this, a comma, and this, a coordinating conjunction, but remember coordinating conjunctions include for, and, nor, but, or, yet, and so. So anyway, when we include the comma and the coordinating conjunction, what we've done is created a longer sentence, right? We've taken two independent clauses and connected them with a comma and a coordinating conjunction. And the coordinating conjunction always signals the relationship between the clauses, right? In this case, but. The girl forgot her bag in the gym, but she returned and found. The relation is this bad thing, this thing that could have been bad happened. However, right, a good thing occurred. So that's the relationship that the coordinating conjunction but is used for here. If the relationship between the independent clauses is clear without a conjunction, in other words, if we could just take the, if it's clear enough, we can take the conjunction out, in this case, the word but, and instead use a semicolon, as seen here. The girl forgot her bag in the gym, semicolon, she returned and found it in the same spot she left it. A writer could also connect the clauses with a semicolon and a conjunctive adverb, like the word in this case, however. The girl forgot her bag in the gym, semicolon, however, comma, she returned and found it in the same spot she left it. That's just an option that you have as well. And as a side note, a semicolon has to be used, must be used, whenever a coordinating conjunction is not used between independent clauses. If you merely use a comma and you don't use a coordinating conjunction, or if you merely use a comma and not a semicolon, you have what's called, it's an error, and it's known as a comma splice. Here's an example. Air pollution poses risk to all humans, comma, it can be deadly for people with asthma. This is a comma splice. The semicolon is also used between items in a series containing internal punctuation. Now, three or more items in a series are usually separated by commas, as we see in this example. She used the colors red, green, blue, and yellow. So we separate all of these items with a comma. But if one or more of the items contained in a sentence has internal punctuation. Now, this is a little confusing right now, but I'll show you an example here to probably make it more clear. But anyway, when you've got a list of items, as is the case here, red, green, blue, yellow, that's a list of items we simply use a comma to separate with. But if you have a list of items and at least one of those items in the list has internal punctuation, then you can use semicolons to divide out the list instead of just commas. And you do this to make sure that the reader is clear what the items are, okay? So here's an example. Science suggests that you can improve your memory by sleeping 7 to 8 hours a day, using mnemonics, self-testing, and visual techniques, and including water, berries, and fish in your diet. So this list includes internal punctuation, namely in this case, commas. So we use semicolons instead of commas to separate the three things in the list. Now, what are the three things in the list here? Sleeping 7 to 8 hours a day, there's the first thing. Using mnemonics, self testing, and visual techniques, there's the second in the list. And including water, berries, and fish in your diet. Notice that there are commas within each of those items, or excuse me, within the last two of those items, right? Using mnemonics, comma, self-testing, and visual techniques. And then the third in the list of items is including water, comma, berries, comma, and fish in your diet. So if we used commas to separate those three items, imagine how confusing that would be. So we use semicolons instead. Now, here are occasions where you don't want to use the semicolon. First, between independent and subordinate clauses, between positives and their references. You don't want to use a semicolon to introduce a list, and you don't want to use a semicolon between independent clauses joined by coordinating conjunctions. So let's look at each of those one at a time. Don't use a semicolon between an independent clause and a subordinate clause. Now, we already know that an independent clause is one that can stand alone, right? You could pull it out of the larger sentence and make it a sentence if you put a period at the end of it. A subordinate clause is a word group containing a subject and a verb that cannot stand alone as a sentence. In this case, the subordinate clause is, although polls show that we work as hard as the generation before us. If we took out the word although, we would see that we have an independent clause. Polls show that we work as hard as the generation before us. But with the word although, we have a dependent clause, specifically called a subordinating clause. These begin with subordinating conjunctions, as is the case here with the word although. Some other subordinating conjunctions are because, if, and, until, or with relative pronouns like who, which, and that. In this sentence, we see the subordinate clause here, right? So we do not want to use a semicolon. Instead, simply use a comma. Don't use a semicolon between an appositive and the word that it refers to. An appositive is a noun or a noun phrase that renames a nearby noun or pronoun. Here's an example of this misuse. Okay, I was fascinated by hiragana, semicolon, a part of the Japanese writing system. In this case, the appositive that renames a part of the Japanese writing system is hiragana. Instead, just use a comma. I was fascinated by hiragana, comma, a part of the Japanese writing system. Also, don't use a semicolon to introduce a list. Here's our example. Some birds are flightless: emus, penguins, and ostriches. Notice I'm using a semicolon here. This is wrong. Instead, we want to make sure that we use a colon. Also, don't use a semicolon between independent clauses joined by coordinating conjunctions, or remember fanboys, for, and, nor, but, or, yet so. Here's our example. The box was filled with heavy objects, semicolon, but they were worthless. Instead, what do? We use a comma. The box was filled with heavy objects, comma, but they were worthless. So let's examine this real quickly. I said don't use a semicolon between independent clauses joined by coordinating conjunctions. The box was filled with heavy objects is an independent clause. They were worthless is an independent clause. So we don't want to use a semicolon between independent clauses that are joined by conjunctions. What is the conjunction here? But. So we don't want semicolon coordinating conjunction. We either have to, in this case, we have to put a colon and a coordinating conjunction. The box was filled with heavy objects, but they were worthless. Or we can simply use a semicolon. The box was filled with heavy objects, semicolon, they were worthless. A colon is used after an independent clause to direct readers' attention to a list and a positive or a quotation. Okay, we just discussed semicolons' usages, several of them, and misusages. Now we're looking at the colon. Okay, so number one, a colon can be used after an independent clause to direct readers' attention to a list. Let's read the example. The routine includes the following: colon, 20 knee bends, 50 leg lifts, 10 push-ups, and running in place. When you're using the colon in this way, be sure that what introduces the list prior to the colon is a complete sentence. In this case, the routine includes the following. For example, following would be the following here would be the misuse of the colon. What's the difference between these two sentences? Let me read the second one. The routine includes colon, 20 knee bends, 50 leg lifts, 10 push-ups, and running in place. Well, the difference is that the words the routine includes, those words are not an independent clause. They are not a complete sentence. Look at the sentence above it. The routine includes the following. That actually is a complete sentence. So make sure that in every case, when you're using a colon to introduce readers' attention to a list or in a positive or a quotation, make sure that in each of those cases you have a complete sentence before the colon. Okay? Where am I? Here I am, and a positive. So you're directing readers' attention to a positive. In this case, my roommate lives on two things: colon, snacks and social media. Remember that an appositive is a noun, or in this case, a noun phrase that renames a nearby noun or pronoun. In this case, the appositive, since it renames two things, is snacks and social media. Notice also that the clause that introduces this is what? Is an independent clause. That's probably the most crucial thing to know about the use of a colon. When you're using the colon to introduce any of these three things, a list and a positive or a quotation, make sure that what comes prior to the colon is an independent clause or a complete sentence. My roommate lives on two things. That could be a sentence in and of itself. And then the third, a colon can be used after an independent clause to direct readers' attention to a quotation. Our example says, consider the words of Benjamin Franklin, quote, there never was a good war or a bad peace. Now, that one's pretty self-explanatory. Notice that, again, and I can't emphasize this enough, that in each of these cases, a colon before a list, a colon before a positive, a colon before a quotation. The colon follows what? An independent clause. That is, we could pull each clause from each sentence, and each could be used, each of those that we pull from each sentence could be used as its own sentence. The routine includes the following: my roommate lives on two things. Consider the words of Benjamin Franklin. Moving on, a colon is used conventionally after the salutation in a formal letter. And by the way, by conventionally, I mean has been used in this way in mostly formal situations in the following, okay? After the salutation in a formal letter, to indicate hours and minutes, to show proportions between a title and a subtitle, to separate city and publisher in bibliography entries, for example, and between chapter and verse in citations of sacred texts like the Bible. A colon must be preceded by an independent clause. Okay, I've emphasized that a lot. So avoid using it in the following situations. And notice in each of these situations, we're breaking that rule. Okay, so between a verb and its object or complement. Here's an example of this misuse. Some important vitamins found in vegetables are vitamin A, thiamine, niacin, and vitamin C. Okay, so what have we done here? We've put a colon between a verb and its object. The verb is the word are, and its objects are each of those vitamins, right? Each of those supplements. Okay. Also, avoid using a colon between a preposition and its object. Remember, prepositions include, well, there are so many of, from, beyond, below, above, etc. Here's an example of that misuse. The heart's two pumps each consist of colon and upper chamber. Okay, so I don't want to read the rest of it. You can see where that preposition is, the word of. We do not want to put a colon after a preposition. That's like a big old no-no. Okay, so make sure that you don't do that. Okay. Let's read this sentence. The NCAA regulates college sports, including basketball, softball, and football. Okay. In each of these cases, oh, and by the way, for this last one, you want to avoid using a colon after the words like including or for example or such as. Okay, don't use a colon after words like that. Okay, so in each of these cases, no colon and no punctuation should be used. So in each of these cases, it's simply write the sentence without colon, without any punctuation at all. Let's review the different common uses of the semicolon and the colon that were discussed. We discussed the uses of the semicolon between independent clauses, between items in a series containing internal punctuation, and we talked briefly about common misuses of the semicolon. We discussed the uses of the colon with lists of positives and quotations. We covered the conventional uses of the colon, and we talked briefly about common misuses of the colon. Hope this has been helpful. Take care, and God bless.